Hi everyone, and welcome to another mini lecture. Here we will take up the topic of diversity and education and consider how diversity works in our public school system. So, what do we mean by diversity? Are we speaking of diversity in terms of categories such as race, gender, and SES? Well, kind of, but simply saying the color of our skin, the gender identity we espouse, or the SES in which we live is diversity seems a bit static. Maybe we need to think about how diversity works in education. Let's look at an example of diversity in terms of categories. You might remember this graph from the Achievement Gap lecture. It depicts the racial and ethnic distribution of public school students from 2003 through 2013. It shows years on the x-axis and percent by enrollment on the y-axis. It also shows differences by geographic region. Beginning from the bottom, or darkest shade of green, we see the percent of students categorized as white. Moving up to the next shade, we see the percent of students categorized as Black, and so on up to 100%. What we can clearly see is the makeup of student populations by race. So, how does this help us understand diversity? Well, we can see that the largest single group of students is categorized as white, although the size of this group is getting smaller. We might know that historically, public education was established to meet the needs of this dominant group, which was originally white, wealthy or wealthy enough to go to school rather than work, and male. Slowly and with varying degrees of success, schools began to serve different race and gender populations. Nevertheless, the origins of U.S. public schooling were created around the needs and interests of this one group, which has historically been the largest. Many scholars argue this thinking is still around today, despite the idea that education is the great equalizer for all groups in our society. What do you think? In the Achievement Gap mini lecture, we looked at the different ways schooling segregates and further emphasizes our differences in terms of categorizing students using data like test scores to create gaps. We saw examples of how education outcomes vary by categories such as race, gender, and SES. And educational approaches to the gap often focused on the so-called deficient groups, which were not the largest or dominant group. We might say that diversity, when thinking about it in terms of categories, serve to magnify our differences. Here is another chart with educational attainment by race. Let's take a moment to read this graph. The x-axis is race and the y-axis is percent. The colors represent different levels of educational attainment. Starting at the bottom with the darkest color, we see that's the percent who have a BA or graduate degree. With each lighter shade of color, we see less educational attainment. Here, we might look at this graph and wonder why so many more people categorized as Hispanic have less than a high school education compared with those categorized as Asian or white. How does diversity work here? Again, when we're thinking of diversity only in terms of categories, it seems to be divisive. The Education Week Research Center developed the Chance for Success Index to better understand the role that education plays in promoting positive outcomes across an individual's lifetime. Based on an original state-by-state analysis, this index combines information from 13 indicators that span a person's life. You can see those 13 indicators on the y-axis on the left. Virginia's grade is a B, and that puts us in 5th place in the nation. We can see in the graph that educational attainment is very important in terms of our overall quote-unquote chances for success. Could we agree then that education is valued by our society? But still, what does this have to do with diversity? How is diversity connected to a cultural or societal value? Let's think about it by looking at this painting by Thomas Granger. What do we know about the culture of school in the U.S. colonial period? This picture is likely depicting students in New England because we know the artist was from Maine, and we see girls, not only boys, which was special to the more progressive ideas in that region in the colonial period. The curriculum was likely basic reading and arithmetic. What could we say about education, diversity, and culture from this painting? If we look beyond the categories, such as race, SES, and gender, we might say that the culture of society at this time and place valued education for boys and girls, although it looks like only white children because we don't see any children of color. We might say that the cultural values of this society are expressed in its education system. Broadly put, culture is a system of values, beliefs, and ways of knowing that guides the decisions of groups of people and communities. Culture intersects with social categories such as race, gender, SES, and many more. In terms of education, culture is reflected in who attends school and who does not, in the curriculum, in who the teachers are, and in how school is funded. So who decides these things? We know we are a pluralistic democratic society comprised of many groups with differing values and beliefs, but one culture is dominant. The dominant culture shapes the larger society, including and especially its education system. Education, then, prepares students to become citizens and workers who function successfully in that dominant culture and promote its values and beliefs. So what happens when people from different cultural groups encounter each other? How well do they communicate, even if both are speaking the same language? Think about teachers and students from different categories or cultures. Do you think they harbor unconscious biases or social stereotypes about each other? Probably they do, but this doesn't mean they are bad people, only that individuals form these biases often outside of their conscious awareness, because that's really how culture works. Everyone holds unconscious beliefs about various social and identity groups, and these biases stem from our tendency to organize the social world by categorizing. If culture intersects with categories, we might say cultural identity is a sense of belonging to that category or group. In our society today, we have many cultural groups. Maybe we should think about how well students from different cultures identify with the dominant culture in their school. More importantly, how well do these students fit in, and how are their needs met by a cultural system that may reflect different values and beliefs? In our increasingly connected world, could we make the case for moving beyond categories and find benefit in thinking about diversity in terms of cultural systems? How might a system of diverse values and beliefs have a positive impact on a community? Let me conclude by coming back to our question. What do we mean by diversity in the context of education? Is it about categories? Well, yes and no. Is it about identity and power? Yes, kind of. Is it about something else? Probably. But I'm going to stop now and leave you to think more deeply about what diversity means.